Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the Minnesota Farm Network for helping us with this and getting it across the state. We have a panel today of ag and rural leaders that will be asking the questions from some of the big issues that are facing rural communities, rural families, and Minnesota agriculture, and they represent a large cross-section of the state of Minnesota. Asking our questions today will be Kevin Papp, President of Minnesota Farm Bureau, Doug Peterson, President of Minnesota Farmers Union, Sarah Dornick, President of Minnesota Agri-Women, and Mark Naisley, who is the CEO of United Farm Credit Services in West Central Minnesota. And before we get to those questions, just to review the ground rules for the candidates as well as the panel and the audience. Once we go back to Tom Rothman, we'll be going right into questions. The candidates have 1 minute to answer on each question. All 6 candidates get a chance to answer. When they have 10 seconds left, I will hold this sign up, which means they have 10 seconds to complete. When they hit the 60-second mark, I hold the one up that says stop, and at that point, Mr. Rothman will probably be soon cutting them off. And then when we get to the closing comments, the same thing will happen. That's 2-minute response on the closing. And for the closing, we'll go in the same order that you're seated, starting with Mr. Dayton. So that's our format. There'll be a couple of breaks in there to catch your breath for our radio networks. Let's have a great forum. I'll turn it back to you, Tom.
All right, thank you, Kent. Yes, we are taking 3 2-minute breaks here over our broadcast over the next hour and 20 minutes. Let's get going now. We're going to have our first question. It is for, let me introduce the panel first. Let's do that. From the DFL party, Margaret Anderson Kelleher. Also from the DFL party, Mark Dayton. And from the DFL party, Matt Entenza. From the Republican Party, Tom Emmer. And from the Independence Party, Tom Horner. And from the Independence Party, Rob Hahn. Our first question is going to come from Kevin Papp, President of the Minnesota Farm Bureau Federation, and our first respondent will be Mark Dayton.
Animal rights organizations are working hard on a state-by-state basis to restrict the way farmers and ranchers raise our livestock. What will you do, and please be specific, if one of these organizations brings forth an initiative to limit the way we raise our livestock in Minnesota?
Well, I strongly support the production of livestock in Minnesota. My great-grandfather down in Nobles County raised livestock as well as being a banker, and my grandfather raised a great Guernsey cows in western Hennepin County back when that was farmland. So if I would oppose anything that would restrict the ability of Minnesota hog, cattle, dairy producers to raise their and house their livestock in accordance with proper environmental protections. That's certainly been an issue with some of the large feedlot lagoon operations, and I think MPCA has made some progress in catching up, the county's catching up to that. So we want those kind of standards to protect our citizenry and protect people on Century Farms who happen to be downwind from some of those operations. But I certainly would not be restricting the ability of those farmers to make a good living through their enterprises.
Margaret Anderson Kelleher.
Well, I'm a strong supporter of production agriculture in this state. I came from production agriculture. I grew up on a small 70-cow dairy farm in the Minnesota River Valley in Blue Earth County, Judson Township, and I know that farmers and ranchers care for their animals. Their animals are their way of life. So we cannot have further restrictions on the way of life to make sure that we can have good, strong production agriculture in the state. The rules are working right now. There's very serious violations. There are closures of those facilities. And so I would not support, as governor, any further restriction on animal production, livestock in the state of Minnesota. I'd make sure we'd fight against that. And And actually, I think one of the good things here is we're not an initiative and referendum state on this issue. And that's the way a lot of these things have been passed in other states. We can't have that happen here. I do not support initiative and referendum. We need to keep a strong production livestock industry right here in Minnesota.
Tom Horner.
Well, animal agriculture is very, very important to Minnesota, and it doesn't succeed if it isn't environmentally responsible, if it isn't engaged in the humane practice of raising animals. So we need to make sure that we're allowing farmers to farm, ranchers to ranch, that we get out of the way, get bureaucracy out of the way, and allow agriculture to do what it does best. I think particularly when we get to these kinds of areas of regulatory burdens, you know, it really is important to let the local community take the lead. I think that's where we really need to put our faith, is what's happening with the local governments, how do they see the opportunities to manage this, working in cooperation with farmers, with ranchers, and making sure that we're deriving full value from this important part of agriculture.
Tom Emmer.
Thanks. Kevin, I thought the question was, what if an animal rights organization tries to bring forward some legislation that would be a further regulation on our farmers in terms of on our livestock operations, telling them, for instance, how to handle their animals, how to house their animals, how to take care of their animals. I would oppose that. I think when you look at regulation, and one of my colleagues just said the rules are working, that's not what I'm hearing all over the state. It's important to have some regulation. I think farmers need to understand that government is there to help them, not to frustrate their ability to farm. And in this case, it seems to me that some of the agenda items that different groups are promoting as animal rights fly directly in the face of what our farmers are trying to do, which is produce the food that we all eat. So I would be opposed to it, but again, we'd have to read it. I have to know what it says first.
Matt Entenza.
Well, I think when you know production agriculture, you know that that problem doesn't exist, because the agriculture producers that we have in the state, our farmers, understand that if you mistreat your animals, if you're not taking care of them, you're going to lose productivity. And so I would veto such legislation. You know, my family came out here to Minnesota 150 years ago. My great-great-grandfather was a veteran of the Civil War. They farmed out in Lackaparle County. Like a lot of families, we lost our farm during the Depression and then wound up down by Rushmore near Worthington, Minnesota, and that's where I grew up. I put myself through college and saved money in high school by working, doing farm work, and by working minimum wage jobs. My wife is from down the road here in Marshall, and so you can know that as governor, I understand how agriculture works. I've got lots of family that are still farming, and you're going to have a governor who's going to stand up for you.
Rob Hahn.
If an animal rights group were to come to me, I would adhere to my open door policy and give them about 15 seconds and then tell them to focus their efforts on a different state. I think what we have right now in this state, by and large, is very good, and I think the farmers need to operate, obviously within regulations that have been established, but need to operate as they are right now, freely to do what they need to do. I don't think there's a place right now for animal rights activists as it applies to farming, and I would definitely listen briefly and then tell them to move on.
All right, our next question is going to be from Doug Peterson. Doug is president of the Minnesota Farmers Union, and Margaret Anderson Kelleher will get the first question, or next question.
Thank you, Tom. For farmers, a huge issue in the last 8 years has been the increase in property taxes. Well, home values and prices have plummeted. Ag values and assessments remain high. What would you tell farmers to expect their property tax situation to look like under your administration?
One of the most important issues that people face right now, the $3 billion increase in property taxes in the last 8 years. This is one of the things that I think is a sharp contrast between DFLers and Republicans in the race for governor. It's very important to know that as DFLers in 2008, we actually fought to reduce the ag homestead class rate from 0.55 down to 0.5. I've proposed, and I will propose as governor, and the legislature I believe will pass, a senior property tax cap at the rate of inflation that will help hold down the homestead rate for seniors on farms. I know this firsthand. My mother still owns the family farm in Blue Earth County in Judson Township. I know this because my mother also owns my father's family farm in Nicollet. I know that this is one of the most important things that people face. It's why we've also tried to do some other things to help farmers, like dairy investment tax credits and others, to make sure that we can have strong production agriculture in the state.
Tom Horner.
While farmers are on the front lines of the property tax battle, this is an issue that affects virtually every Minnesota property owner, and it is a direct result of actions taken by the legislature over the last couple of years. When the legislature insists on cutting the support for local governments, when it insists on passing bad public policies that push health care costs off onto rural Minnesota, when it makes bad policy that leaves our schools operating on 4-day weeks, that's just bad public policy, some of which comes out in higher property taxes. So we have to be aggressive in identifying the responsible relationship between the state government and local governments. One area that we need to work on is on the aid to counties. 40% of county taxes is directly related to the unfunded mandates that the state imposes on counties. We need to get over that kind of activity and make sure that we have responsible state government so that our local governments can operate efficiently.
Well,
Tom Emmer.
There will be a distinct difference here. First off, tillable land should not be supporting every other service that a municipality or that the government provides. So you've got to make sure that that gets changed. Second, what nobody else seems to want to acknowledge is that the problem is not that government doesn't have a good relationship with government and that government's not telling people enough of what to do. The problem is that people that are inside government are totally unwilling to reform it. Reduce the size of it, get rid of the bloat and the excess, start to put people back in charge of their own opportunities. Let farmers make decisions that benefits their farm and their family instead of having government constantly showing up with more bureaucrats every day. By the way, looking down at your broken tile and saying after 3 weeks after you fill out that permit request, they come out and look down and say, yep, your tile's broken, you can fix it. We don't need that kind of government.
Matt Entenza.
We need a government that's going to be responsive and respectful of the fact that property taxes, I believe, are the worst possible taxes. They're not based on the ability to pay. They hurt our farmers and producers more than any other because, of course, you rely on land. And so taxes on land, if the crop prices go down, you still get hit hard. When you have a medical crisis, and of course the average farm family has a $5,000, $10,000 deductible on your health insurance and your property taxes go up, you get hit with a medical crisis, you get hurt. Now there's folks that say, oh, no new taxes. Well, you know what no new taxes has meant? No new taxes has meant that it gets shifted onto you. It's meant that it trickles down onto property taxes. And the wealthiest in our state aren't paying the same percentage of taxes as you are, and that's unfair. And fees go up as well, 65% over the course of the last 7 years. So as governor, I believe that we have to reduce the size of government because of the deficit, but we also have to make sure that we're not increasing property taxes. We need the right mix there.
Rob Hahn.
Two of the cornerstones of my budget proposal, the $6 billion man proposal that I set forth a couple weeks ago in detail, are reform, primarily in the area of tax reform, and redesign. And property taxes certainly need to be looked at because, as others on this panel have said, it doesn't just affect farmers, it affects everyone in Minnesota. But it's going to be solved through redesigning how we take services to the end user, getting rid of government bureaucracy, redesigning the relationship between the state and the counties and the cities, looking at LGA. Everywhere I've gone throughout the state, especially in rural Minnesota, people want to know two things. What are you going to do about LGA and what are you going to do about a Viking stadium? The LGA issue, it needs to be reformulated. It's being used for ways that it was, in ways it was never intended, but we can't just cut it. We can't just shut it off and say, fend for yourselves, because that's going to result in increased property tax. It has to be a governor-led redesign of how we take services to the end user and make sure we keep taxes and property taxes in mind when we do it.
Mark Dayton.
I agree with Speaker Kelleher that this is a defining issue between Democrats and Republicans. And as Representative Intenza said, the property tax is the most unfair tax. You have to pay it whether or not your farm's producing a profit, whether your small business producing a profit, whether you have a job and an income. And the reason property taxes have gone up in this last decade, more than doubled Minnesota, is not rhetoric. It's dollars and cents. It's the Governor Plenty has cut funding for local government aids, for county aids, for township aids, school districts, and property taxes have gone up to pick up about half of that cut. Now, the Republican proposal is to eliminate local government aids. How that constitutes reform is beyond me. We need to make the richest people in this state pay their fair share of taxes. That's the progressive tax. When millionaires are paying only 2/3 as a percent of their income in state and local taxes, what the rest of Minnesotans are paying, that's fundamentally wrong. That's fundamentally unfair. We need to make them pay their fair share of taxes, and that can go into local government aids, school aids, and keeping property taxes down for farmers and everyone.
Our next question is going to be answered first by Tom Horner and Sarah Dornick of Minnesota Agri-Women. Go ahead.
Thank you. Given the large state budget shortfall, what policies will you support to ensure that all children of Minnesota have an equal opportunity to receive a quality education, which is not determined by school size, class size, or where you live?
Well, and let me go back to something that Representative Emmer said, because it does reflect on this. And I'm going to say, Representative Emmer, saying things louder doesn't make them any better. It doesn't change the policy. You know, for the last several years, we've had a government that has ignored exactly this kind of issue and has created policies where schools do have to go to 4-day weeks. So we need to do a couple of things. First, we need to invest in early learning. We need to make sure every child enters kindergarten prepared to learn. Secondly, we need to make sure that our schools in small communities around the state have the resources and the policies that allow us to maintain those schools and maintain quality education in those schools. Third, I think we need to look at education as a seamless system from cradle to grave and make sure that people throughout their lives have an opportunity to learn. And lastly, we need to invest as a state in ultra-high-speed broadband access to every corner of the state so that people have access to the world-class education, world-class health care, and world-class economic development opportunities.
Tom Emmer.
You know, people, politicians, people who have been in the system for a long time like to talk about investment and talk about how we need to put more money here and there. We need to start recognizing that while we have the greatest teachers in the world, our education system is not producing kids that are at the top of the world in terms of the measurements. Folks, we are no longer just competing with Wisconsin, Iowa, North and South Dakota. Yes, our kids scored highest in the country last year on ACTs, but guess what? ACTs have been watered down over the year. The fact is, our kids are being produced right in the middle of the pack internationally, and that's where they're competing. It's time to quit talking about business as usual, and I'm sorry if I say it a little louder. I'm very passionate about it, but we got to start talking about a new way that's more about the parents and their child, what's best for the child. Give more choice. Start looking at the model that we've got in place right now. Let's start looking at the next century for education instead of just following through and letting the union control what's happening in the schools.
Matt Intenza.
Let's take a look at what's happened to Minnesota schools over the last 20 years, and to rural schools in particular. I graduated from Worthington Senior High in a family where I lost my dad when I was 15. I got to do activities without paying fees. We had a full range of programs and band and things like that. And you know what's happened to my home high school? One by one, we've watched those things go away. The same in my wife's high school at Marshall. I was in Grand Meadow a little while ago down by Albert Lee, and you know what was going on down there? They'd fired their last language teacher because the state wasn't providing resources to help a small rural district, and they couldn't put it on the backs of their farmers. So when those kids want to apply to the U now, they can't get into the U except as remedial students. What are we doing to our state? We used to have a bipartisan belief that education was what brought us forward. And as governor, I'm going to have to make some tough choices. We're going to have to cut some things back. And we are going to have to raise some revenue. But we can't do it on the backs of our future, which is our kids. And on our rural communities, if we expect to move forward, how are we going to move forward when our schools bluntly are being gutted and gilled? We can't let that happen. And that's why we need a governor who's going to stand up for our rural schools and our schools across the state.
Rob Hahn.
I want to follow up on a couple things that were said. When it comes to education, particularly K through 12 or E through 12, obviously it's very important, but we have to adapt. Things change. And unfortunately, the union has not. Education Minnesota has been a roadblock over and over when it comes to changing our school systems. Two things need to happen. We have to make sure that the union adapts to current day policies and reality. And we have to make sure that these schools throughout the state at the top level are run like businesses. They can't expect to get government money year after year and increase year after year. We have to hold them accountable. We have to look at the smaller districts and say, maybe it's time you merge your administration staffs. We have to look at the classrooms separately and say, what can we do? There are so many opportunities now. You mentioned language. We can look at online language. It doesn't make sense for a school to have one teacher for 2 pupils, but that doesn't mean those pupils can't take languages. We have to adapt to where we are in 2010 and beyond.
Mark Dayton.
Sir, your question is an excellent one because it goes back to what the Minnesota Supreme Court ruled over 40 years ago, that the quality of an education should not depend on where a child's born or is raised. And relying on the property tax primarily to fund K-12 education is inherently unfair and unequal. And that's what we've moved to increasingly in the last decade because, again, under Governor Pawlenty, the per pupil state aid has been cut by an average of $1,300 per student after inflation. Now, I taught first job out of college in a public school in New York City. I've always said it was the toughest job I ever had. I had 32 kids in a 9th grade classroom, and I couldn't reach individually all of those students. So when I go to Rochester, Minnesota, and I see 36 children in a 5th grade classroom with 1 teacher, I know we're going in the wrong direction. When we have 10 school districts now in Minnesota going to 4-day school weeks for lack of funding, we're going in the wrong direction. We need reform. We also need to provide the funds so that those reforms can succeed.
Margaret Anderson Kelleher.
Well, Sarah, as a mom with kids in Minnesota public schools, my kids are 16 and 13. I have been on the front line of this with you as I've seen property taxes rise, and there are not enough bake sales and book sales and wrapping paper sales in this state to raise the sort of money that we need. We need to do this fairly. We need to do it in a balanced approach. And what I'm going to do is, whether you're a kid in Redwood Falls, or you're a kid in Roseville, or you're a kid in Roseau, Minnesota, or you're a kid in Rochester, you're going to have an equitable education again in the state of Minnesota, because I'm the only candidate that has a plan to do it over the next 6 years, to make sure that we relieve $600 million of property tax burden on all property taxpayers across this state, and make sure that we get back to that equitable education. And can I also say, as a former state 4-H president, I think there's more to education than just in the doors of the school. We need to restore our commitments to 4-H and FFA, so there's out-of-school time activities for kids all across the state, including rural kids.
Our next question comes from our panelist, Mark Knisely. He is with United Farm Credit Services. And first up will be Tom Emmer.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. As a farmer-owned cooperative, United FCS and the Farm Credit System supplies debt capital in the forms of loans and leases, along with a wide array of financial services to farmers in rural America. As such, United FCS is focused on enhancing and contributing to the long-term success of agriculture in rural communities by providing a reliable and dependable source of credit and financial services. Please share specific examples of programs and actions you would take as governor to enhance the long-term success of agriculture in rural Minnesota.
Well, thank you, Mark. I'll give you 2 right away. First, you lower taxes. You absolutely have to lower taxes, and you have to address tillable land supporting everything else. And if you look in our history, if you lower taxes, and I love everybody who talks about, we need to put more money here, we need to put more money here, we're going to cut some stuff, we're going to raise some others. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know what's been happening in this country over the past several decades. What we've been doing has not been working. You've got to lower taxes. You've got to put more money in the people's pockets so they can create their own opportunities. And when we talk about our great farms across the state of Minnesota, you've got to start to have the regulatory agencies work with the farmers and not against them. I go up north and I find out, I meet Amos and Eamon Bear, who run a hog operation that they wanted to expand in this state. 2 years and $40,000 just to get through the state permitting process. And if they had gotten through the permitting process, there was no guarantee they would have gotten the permits. But even if they did, they had to go county and state or city. Guess what? They opened in North Dakota in 6 months. They have a payroll of $1.4 million. Those jobs should be here in Minnesota.
Matt Entenza.
Well, Tom and I are going to have a little disagreement on policy, because the no new taxes that we've seen coming out of Governor Pawlenty and with Tom's help have not been helping the farms here in southwest Minnesota. They've been helping the mansions around Lake Minnetonka. Those are the folks that are getting the big tax breaks and holding the big tax breaks and bluntly paying less taxes as a percentage of their income than you are or my relatives are who are farming. And the tax burden has been pushed onto fees and onto property taxes. We absolutely need to help make sure that we get more money onto the bottom line, Mark. And that means that we need to get property taxes down. But that means that we can't be balancing budgets on the backs of rural Minnesota, where when local government aid keeps becoming the favorite place to cut, and of course that hits our rural communities particularly hard, it doesn't hurt the crowd around Minnetonka hard, it hurts you. And it hurts poor communities. Secondly, we need to find other ways to do value added. One of those is, of our $10 billion we spend on energy, 95% of that leaves the state. We need to create more opportunities for farmers rather than big out-of-state corporations owning wind power and wind turbines and creating more jobs in Minnesota, so that you get the money from that rather than out-of-state corporations.
Rob Hahn.
Given the way Representative Emmer is becoming the campaign punching bag, I'm kind of hesitant to actually agree with him, but I will on this. I'll say we do need fewer taxes. We do need to make Minnesota more business friendly. And just because we do that doesn't mean we're benefiting the rich. Also included in my budget proposal is an increased or an additional creation of an additional tax bracket on the uber rich, those families making $250,000 or more a year. And it's not going to be a tax on small business, as others have suggested. It's going to be a tax on the rich who derive their income, the majority of those people, 94% of them, from forms of revenue and business other than small business. So we need to make Minnesota more business friendly, and that applies to the farms. And we can't just keep going on and throwing out money here, throwing out money there. You're going to hear a theme from me over and over today that sometimes, and in this case often, less is more.
Mark Dayton.
Well, I agree we need to reduce taxes, particularly property taxes, and anyone who thinks that the proposal to eliminate local government aids and county aids and to reduce state funding for education is not going to result in higher property taxes for farmers and everyone else does not understand the basic fiscal realities of the state of Minnesota. Now, Mark, I appreciate your providing credit, and that's a key part of agriculture. It's no substitute for farm income. And as I learned from Norm Larson, a farmer in Nobles County, when I first ran for the Senate in 1982, farmers have got to make a profit in the marketplace, as my family did in retailing, as anyone else does, in order to be successful. So when the price of corn today in Minnesota is less than, in real dollars after inflation, is only about 3/4 of what it was when I was running for the Senate in 1982, the costs of production have gone up. And that's true of commodities across the spectrum in Minnesota. There's something terribly wrong in this country with underpricing our value of our farm commodities, forcing reliance on credit rather than on profits.
Margaret Anderson Kelleher.
This is all about jobs. This whole election's about jobs. It's the #1 thing. Our economy and jobs are on people's mind. We have 204,000 Minnesotans out of work, more than that most likely. What we need to do is we need to have a strong economy across the state, everywhere in the state. And so that's why I put together a jobs plan. That's why I believe so strongly in organizations like AURI. And I fought to make sure their funding was restored in this budget so that it wasn't cut 50%, because look at the good work they're doing on value-added agriculture. We know the key is raising the profit above the cost of production, and that means finding innovative ways to do that. Whether it's my support for biofuels in the state of Minnesota, making them more efficient and more effective in the state, and being able to make sure that we have small business credit in the state of Minnesota, so when you have that good idea and you want to start that business on Main Street, you can have the credit to do it. It's all about creating a better life for people in the state of Minnesota. I'm going to be a partner in doing that as governor.
Tom Horner.
I think the critical issue in 2010 is leadership. Who's going to take Minnesota into the future? And to do that, we need to stop fighting the battles, the political battles of the last 8 years, and focus on what the agenda ought to be for the next 8 years. And so under a Governor Horner, we are going to have a state in which we let teachers teach, we let businesses create jobs, and we let farmers farm. And we get there by creating a government that is smaller, that is less onerous, less bureaucratic, but also smarter. We need to be making investments in the future. We need to be making investments in our infrastructure, rail, in 10-ton roads to get your products to market. We need to be making investments in education, in our schools. We need to have a permitting process, a regulatory process in which the government says, guaranteed, 6 months, you'll have an answer. We're not going to drag these decisions out for a year, 18 months, 2 years, 6 months, you'll have an answer.
Candidates, we're going to take our first break here, and we're going to pause for 10 seconds for stations on this broadcast to identify themselves. You're listening to the Governor's Candidate Forum from Farmfest 2010.
That everyone please stay away from the stage so we can get started. There'll be plenty of time to visit with the candidates when we get through.
If the governor has his way, Minnesota would join half the nation's other states that want to designate English as the official language. Tim Pawlenty says the move would save money when it comes to translating official documents. The number of Americans who own homes continues to fall, but Ed Nelson of the Minnesota Home Ownership Center says that might not be such a bad thing.
I think over the past couple of years, we've learned that homeownership at any cost is not a good thing. That's what got us into the problem we're in now.
Nelson says Sherburne, Wright, and Isanti counties have been hit especially hard. The Minnesota Department of Health says there should be plenty of flu vaccine to go around this year, and unlike last year, this fall you won't have to get 2 flu shots. That's because H1N1 protection will be part of the regular seasonal vaccine. This special Farmfest report brought to you by the Minnesota Soybean Growers Association. I'm Tasha Radel.
This is a remote village in Mali, West Africa. This is Salif Diarra, a local health worker. These are some of the 123 village children who survive life-threatening illnesses because of his efforts. These are the paths that Salif walks, sometimes miles each day, to visit all the sick children in his village. This is Minata, a mother who was afraid she'd lose her 4-year-old daughter to malaria. And this is Maimuna, one of the many children who got her joy back thanks to Salif's efforts. This is you becoming part of the story. You are one step away from helping local health workers like Salif make the good go even further. Visit goodgoes.org to see the many ways you can help. Brought to you by Save the Children and the Ad Council.
Okay, if we could have everyone kind of quiet down. We're just a few seconds away from going back on the air, and we'll go back to another question. So if we could have everybody kind of quiet back down here.
Welcome back to the Governor's Debate and Forum here at Farmfest 2010. I'm Tom Rothman with the Minnesota Farm Network. Our broadcast is being aired on radio stations across Minnesota, affiliates of the Minnesota Farm Network and Minnesota News Network. We're going to continue with our forum. Our next question is for Matt Intenza, and it is from Kevin Papp with the Minnesota Farm Bureau Federation. Go ahead, Kevin.
There are current state and federal restrictions on the use of crop protection products, such as setbacks from waterways, maximum application rates, and limitations on application times based on wind speed. Now, the farmers in this tent understand the label is the law. What are your views on further state restrictions on the use of crop protection products that apply only to Minnesota farmers?
One of the things that folks often forget when they live in the Twin Cities is that agriculture is our #1 business in Minnesota. Agriculture is the #1 way that we hold the state together. And as someone who is from Worthington, who's got lots of family that farms, I know that our farmers understand that they have to follow the law and that they have to be careful about their land. No farmer wants to see the lakeshore that they're near, the rivers that they're near, the wetlands that they're near become polluted, because ultimately that's a problem for them. And I appreciate how the Farm Bureau and Farmers Union and other organizations have worked hard to do that. And therefore, I see no need whatsoever to put additional state-only restrictions. That puts Minnesota farmers at a competitive disadvantage, and that's not a place that we can afford to be. We need a state that recognizes that if we're going to be successful, we have to do a better job of making sure that we get more value out of agriculture. And that's why I favor making sure that our farmers get the help that they need, not only with no additional restrictions, but we need to help extension. Extension used to be a great help, but of course we've seen that pared back. And we need to make sure we have other efforts to make sure we got value-added agriculture there to help out as well.
Rob Hahn.
Remember what I said just a while ago, that sometimes less is more? I'll be real brief here. I would oppose any further restrictions. I think what we have in place is serving its purpose right now.
Mark Dayton.
The report just the other day that Minnesota's corn and soybean crops are the best in the country. That's the goal we want for Minnesota agriculture. We want the best production, the best quality, and anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. And we have the best farmers in this world, so we know we'll get that if we allow you to farm as the wise stewards of your land that you are. And I understand that from my family background. From my grandfather, my father, my great-grandfather, the stewardship of the land is integral to the consciousness of the men and women who are our farmers. So I would oppose any additional state restrictions that would harm that competitiveness, that would take away your abilities to be the best producers in the world and to have the maximum production so you can maximize your income, which is, anybody on Main Street, Minnesota knows that the health of Minnesota's economy depends on the health of our agricultural economy.
Margaret Anderson Kelleher.
Well, my farm roots are deep. You've heard a little bit about that, but they're still growing in Minnesota. My family is still farming in this state. In fact, right over near Wabasso, my niece and her husband and their young daughter, Mallory, they are farming today. And, you know, when I think about that, I know that they know this point, that the label is the law, and they want to protect air, land, and water. Farmers are the original conservationists in this state. I learned those lessons from my dad growing up along the Minnesota River Valley, right along the river, how important it is to take care of the land, air, and water. And you know, farmers are best at that. I think that we need to work together, more cooperative models of doing this. The idea that we work together and have incentives to make sure that we are working together to protect land, air, and water is important to me. I would not support further restrictions on applications, and what we need to do is we need to make sure that you can have successful production agriculture in the state so you can support your family.
Tom Horner.
Well, the label is the law, but in a Horner administration, common sense will be the guidepost. We need to move away from the kinds of regulatory stretches that punish people into a process in which we can work together to accomplish the goal, accomplish it more effectively by letting farmers farm. And so a good example, in areas where a water treatment facility may have to expand to manage the increased capacity, why don't we work with farmers to allow them to plant grasses upstream along drainage ditches where we can filter the waters, where we can do some common sense kinds of solutions, and then allow the farmers to harvest those grasses for biofuels, for feed. You know, it's those kinds of solutions that make sense. We need to figure out how we accomplish these goals, how we protect our natural heritage, but how we do it in a way that makes sense for everyone.
Tom Emmer.
You know, Kevin, when I hear you say the label is the law, I mean, I live in Delano, Minnesota. Jackie and I and our 7 kids. I don't know when the last time any one of these guys actually baled hay. I did it last fall. I'm not very good at it either, by the way. You know, my daughter was in 4-H, so we're living it. And the one thing that I know from where we live, farmers are the best environmentalists going. And we keep talking about cooperative partnerships and working together and doing what's best for everybody else, but that just means that people in government that have no concept of what happens on the farm are telling farmers what they're going to have to do to regulate their land. You don't need more restrictions. You need more freedom. You got to allow farmers to use government as the resource it was intended to be so that they can make the most out of their 401k, because that is not only their livelihood and they will take the best care of it, but it is their future and their family's future.
Our next question, and I believe it is going to be for Rob Hahn, comes from Doug Peterson. Doug is president of the Minnesota Farmers Union. Doug?
Real simple. Do you support or oppose the biofuel mandates in Minnesota on E10 and B5, and would you support continuing them?
No, not necessarily do I support the mandates. I'm a little hesitant as a small business owner to support any mandate. I think sometimes we by creating these mandates, we back ourselves into a corner that we can't extract ourselves from. But having said that, I would certainly support moving forward with a lot of these the ideas that are in the mandates of looking at alternative fuels, alternative forms of energy. I'm very hesitant to say we've got to do it this way and we've got to do this amount by this time, because it's not always in the best interest of the people involved, and certainly not always in the best interest of the state.
Mark Dayton.
Well, I totally disagree with Mr. Hahn. I think the Minnesota mandate, which was the first in the nation for ethanol, has been crucial to the development of the economy in Minnesota, trying to boost market prices and also add value for Minnesota corn producers through the ethanol production. I would continue to support the mandates for both ethanol and for increasing those percentages over the years ahead as envisioned, as well as for biodiesel fuels. I'm a strong supporter of ethanol, E85 fuel, when I was in the U.S. Senate, for increasing the national renewable fuel standards that would extend those Minnesota pioneering standards across the country, so that we change this country's dependency from imported oil or even domestically produced oil to indigenous renewable crop resources and biofuels here. You know, there's never been an ethanol spill in the Gulf of Mexico that's destroyed the ecology of that part of this country the way it happened this summer. So we have all sorts of reasons, economic and ecological, to move to biofuel and other fuels.
Margaret Anderson Kelleher.
I would not only support the biofuels mandate, I will continue to support the biofuels mandate, as I have all along in my career. We are the father of the biofuels mandate out in the audience today, Dave Frederickson. His first work in the legislature was to put this in place. We need to keep up with this. We need to make sure that we are working towards a more efficient product in biofuels. And I know that is happening out here because there's innovation going on. There's innovation going on with AURI. There's innovation going on with the University of Minnesota, and we know that this is about jobs. I know this is about jobs. This is about value added. It's about pushing that production cost, the income you're making above the production cost, and this is another way to do it. Now, my Republican opponent, Tom Emmer, has not supported biofuels, and I'm going to be very interested in his answer today, because he's voted against it in 2008, in 2008 twice, in 2005, and you know, it's interesting when people they say one thing and they actually do another. You can always depend. I know where I came from, I know who I'm fighting for.
Tom Horner.
Well, I do support the blend and would even be open to looking at a higher blend rate. But I also think, look, we've got a $6 billion shortfall. Let's be realistic. Everybody up here says we're going to cut government, we're going to make government smaller, and no one says, and here's where we're going to start. I do think, honestly, we need to transition away from the subsidy for ethanol. I think we need to look at an entirely new policy for renewable and alternative energy that is based in research at the universities around the state so that we get the best technologies coming out, support from government, from the public, that is fair, that is transparent, and that moves the market forward, and policies that are environmentally responsible. And so, you know, we have to be honest with people to say we do need new energy policies. We don't need more government.
Tom Emmer.
Thanks. I support any alternative form of energy that we should be exploring. I think government needs to get out of the way and let people do it. And I'm not sure where Margaret's looking, but I had to ask, because I'm pretty sure I voted for the biodiesel mandate. I've never been a big fan of mandates, folks, but here's what it is. It's about jobs. Not only should we support all exploration and activity for new, inexpensive, efficient forms of energy to drive our economy, and that includes ethanol, that includes biodiesel, that includes anything that might be out there, but we should also lift the moratorium on nuclear. We absolutely should find ways to get people moving again and stop having the political professionals tell us what we can and can't do. So I support it from that perspective, whatever we can do.
Matt Entenza.
I not only have supported our farmer ethanol producers and biodiesel producers, but I've been there in the fight. And as you know, Doug, in 1995, we saw big oil take a big run at us. I was a newly elected legislator, and there were a lot of folks who came at me and said, oh my gosh, the folks that have older cars, the people who want to run their snowmobiles and everything's dying. We got to get rid of this ethanol mandate. We got to pull it back. And Doug, as you know, I stood there right with you when they were trying to even take a bill away from you so that they could try and take control of things. I stood with you, and I stood with the Farmers Union and Farm Bureau on that because it's so important. Because we need value added. I believe we actually need to make sure that we take the next steps. That's why, besides education being my top priority, I believe it's jobs, and I believe one of the best ways to get jobs is not only more wind energy that's locally owned here in rural Minnesota, but the next generation of ethanol, which will come with grasses, or in northern Minnesota with wood pulp. That's a way to create new billion-dollar industries right here. We should pay ourselves for our fuel and not some dictator in the Middle East.
All right, we're going to take the second of our 3 2-minute breaks. You're listening to the Governor Candidate Forum at Farmfest 2010.
Right now, decisions are being made in St. Paul and Washington, D.C. that will affect your farm by people who have never set foot on one. That's why belonging to the Minnesota Soybean Growers Association is so important. MSGA is focused on ensuring that farmer-friendly legislation remains a top priority for state and national legislators. This is something your checkoff dollars cannot legally do. So become an MSGA member today. Stop by tent number 618 or Farmfest, or visit mnsoybean.org. Right now, politicians are taking action on legislation that will affect your farm. The Minnesota Soybean Growers Association is here to make sure that your voice is part of the discussion. Your membership in MSGA gives you the ability to provide input on environmental regulations to protect the land, support the use of biodiesel, and ensure the growth of the livestock industry. You can make a difference. Your MSGA membership is the key. Find out more in tent 618 at Farmfest or visit mnsoybean.org.
Is he a Democrat? 1 minute I'm fine. Then out of nowhere I'll get this terrible pain in my hands. Another day my face is swollen. It's so frustrating. I'm 27 but I feel like I'm 72. I was gonna get married next summer. Now my wedding's on hold. My life is on hold. I've never felt so scared and alone. I want answers.
I want answers. I'm a junior in college. At least I was. I'm home now because I'm so sick. Now my hair's falling out. You know how embarrassing
Candidates, we have about 30 seconds.
Like I'm going crazy.
Come on back up,
My friends
candidates.
don't call me anymore. I don't care. I don't care about anything.
I don't care about anything. I don't even try to hide the Russian.
If we could have everyone be seated. We need the candidates back on the stage. We're going back on here, so
what's happening to me. For answers, ask your doctor.
If we could have everybody quiet down and be seated again, we're going back on.
Visit
Sarah will have the next question. So
994-9662. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office on Women's Health and the Ad Council.
Welcome back to our Governor's Candidate Forum here at Farmfest 2010. I'm Tom Rothman, moderator of today's event, and we're going to continue. We have about another half hour in our program. Our next question, and it is going to be directed at candidate Mark Dayton, is going to be from Sarah Dornick of Minnesota Agri-Women. Sarah, go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Mr. Dayton, what future opportunities do you see for women in agriculture?
Well, of course, women have been integral partners to men in agriculture ever since farming began. And I think the efforts we want to encourage through the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, through the Young Farmer programs, is to encourage more women, more men. I commend Speaker Kelleher for her getting started in the youth programs, as I've seen youth all over this state involved at the county fairs and the state fairs. We want to be encouraging that, because women should be as successful in agriculture as men. And of course, young women and girls who aspire to agriculture should see that as having a future. Having an opportunity to, as I said earlier, make a good profit, have a good living, live where they choose, do what they love to do, raise a family, keep their children on the land, and grow old with their farms over the next century. That's been the spirit of Minnesota. It's been the greatness of Minnesota, and that's what we want to assure for the future.
Margaret Anderson Kelleher.
Well, Sarah, I think the future is bright for women in agriculture, because agriculture is 20% of our state economy, and there are so many ways to be involved. I'm proud that my mom and dad gave me the best example possible. They were equal partners in that farm. Carl and Elaine were equal partners every single day. And I have to tell you that a couple of months ago, my brothers are out in the audience today. Craig and Ken, Bruce, will you wave? They farm the family farm. And a couple of months ago, my daughter Franny, who's 13 years old, said, "Mom, what happens to the farm when they don't want to farm anymore?" Because they're a little bit older than I am, and she is. And I said, "Well, I don't know. You might have to ask them what's going to happen to the family farm when they're done farming." And she said to me, "Maybe I want to farm the family farm." And I thought, you go for it, girl. You know that? That's what we need to be encouraging. And we need leadership opportunities for young women in rural areas like 4-H, like FFA, so they get the experience of becoming leaders.
Tom Horner.
Sarah, I think the opportunity for women in agriculture ought to be exactly the same for women in every other profession. I mean, we need to create a state in which everybody is judged on their talent, everybody is judged on their skill, everybody is judged on their commitment to building a better state, to creating better families, to building a better community. That ought to be the basis for Minnesota and how we evaluate people. And to get there, do we need a smaller, smarter, more efficient government? Absolutely. But do we also need a government that is willing to invest in good education to make sure that every child has the opportunity to go into school prepared to learn, that every person has the opportunity for lifelong learning, that we have strong two-year schools around the state? I mean, look how important our two-year schools are to communities throughout the state, to agriculture, and yet look how we're allowing them to have some mission creep. That's what leadership is to stand up to say, it's not just about what happens on the land, it's about the infrastructure, it's about education, it's about research, it's about becoming a knowledge state, not just for women, but for all Minnesotans.
Tom Emmer.
Thank you for the question, Sarah. I, as a father, husband and a father of 6 boys and 1 daughter, this becomes very focused in our house. And I will tell you that it really is, as I was growing up, I had 1 sister, and it was different. There were different opportunities. That's changed, I believe, although at times you wonder. There are certain avenues where women, I think, get treated differently. We got to keep working towards equalizing that, but at the end of the day, it's about all being Minnesotans and having the same opportunities to succeed, whether it's on the farm or in a food-related or agricultural-related business. 1 out of 5 jobs in this state is related to agriculture in one way or another. It's about lowering taxes, reducing regulation, giving people the opportunity to keep more of their money and create more of their opportunities. That's how you will have both women and men succeeding in the state of Minnesota and hopefully carrying on the family tradition, the farming tradition that is Minnesota.
And when we hit a bump in the road, they're the ones who had to pick up the slack and make things work. Now, when I was in high school, you only saw boys in FFA. You didn't see a lot of girls there. And the times have changed, and they need to continue to change. And as someone who's got family in farming, and my cousins, it's not just the guy that's farming, they're a couple, and they do it together. And we need to make sure that working with Extension, working with all of our high school programs, the 4-H and FFA and others, that we have those strong models so that all of our young women know that they've got a great future in agriculture.
Rob Hahn.
It comes down, Sarah, I think, to creating opportunities and giving people the chance to prepare for those opportunities. You know, I notice it's one thing to sit up here, as some of my colleagues have done, and said that they're going to provide leadership, and then they wax on poetically about their, vision for the state without any hardcore specific. I actually have been very specific, and one of the proposals I've set forth could certainly apply to your question. It's called PIE. It stands for Partners in Education. And it's a proposal that would, on one hand, reduce tuition burdens for college students at both 2- and 4-year institutions, public institutions, and at the same time prepare them even more specifically for the workplace, because businesses, part of the partnership, would be involved in creating a curriculum around them and then hiring those students, both as students and then a certain number of them as graduates. I think that is the type of vision that I have for the state, where we have very specific ideas about working together and creating opportunities, and PIE is just one of those ways.
We have time for another question before we get to our closing comments and one more break from our candidates today. Our next question comes from Mark Nisley. He is with United Farm Credit Services, and Margaret Anderson Kelleher gets the first question.
Thanks, Tom. This morning we've discussed the importance of farm profitability and business viability. On the expense and business transition side of production agriculture, we can't overlook the availability of preventative health care coverage and high health insurance costs for ag producers. Health insurance costs have significant negative impacts on farm profitability and potentially restrict farm transitions to the next generation. The Citizens League of Minnesota recently reported that Minnesota farmers pay an average of double the price for health insurance coverage as compared to the rest of the state, and as a result, farmers have started to drop coverage, and that percent has increased of farmers without health insurance coverage from 7% to 15% over the last decade. A cooperative option is available, assuming that the State Department of Commerce approves the pilot program beginning in 2011. Do you support a cooperative health insurance option for Minnesota agricultural community, and if so, what steps would you take as governor to make sure the program succeeds?
Well, I do support the cooperative model. I've looked at that report and seen what Wisconsin has done. I think it's a promising thing. I know firsthand what this means. When I was growing up, 16 of us were supported by our small family farm. And definitely health care was one of the issues that started to cause significant pressure. All of my sister-in-laws who were partners in farming needed to go get those town jobs so they could get health insurance. You all know what I'm talking about. And what we need to do here is we need to do a few things. I'm supportive of this cooperative model. I think the Department of Commerce should approve it. It's an important thing. But we also need to bring the federal dollars home to the state of Minnesota that are going to stabilize our hospitals and clinics. It'll be the first thing I do after taking the oath of office, to bring early MA home to the state. You know what it means locally here? It means $1.6 million to Rice Memorial in Wilmer. It means $1.1 million to the Marshall hospitals and clinics. It means almost $1 million to New Ulm Medical Center. That's significant. We need to do it. We need to bring those tax dollars home.
Tom Horner.
Minnesota will be a state in which everyone has access to low-cost, high-quality health care through the private sector. And we have to make that commitment, and we have to deliver on it. And Minnesota has a pretty good head start, in part because we put in good programs, in part because we have some good policies, and in part because we have innovation, including this cooperative idea, which I do support. But we also have done some terribly dumb things. I mean, look at how the legislature fumbled the ball on the health care program for the lowest income Minnesotans, GAMC. They left a lot of people high and dry without coverage. And then those few people who are going to be able to get care, they dumped them off onto rural hospitals, and so now the rural hospitals are going to be challenged. We can't afford to do dumb things. We have a good base of health care in Minnesota in the private sector. We need to keep building on that.
Tom Emmer.
Absolutely, we have to attack this issue, not only for our farm families, farm corporations in Minnesota, but for all business across the state and all our citizens. First, a very myopic view when you say you want to opt into another federal program. Perhaps rather than saying we need to bring those tax dollars home, we should start talking about why we're sending as many as we are. It also is myopic from the standpoint that you're going to spend $430 million, and by the way, folks, we're $5 to $7 billion in the hole already. You're going to spend that over the first 3 years. It's a bad program because Minnesota has succeeded based on high-quality care at low cost, and the government, the federal government, will only reward you based on volume of care. It's totally against what the state of Minnesota believes in and what we've created. You want to solve this problem, you do 3 quick things. 1, you give tax deductibility to the individual just like businesses. 2, you allow people to put greater pooling options. 3, you allow them to tailor the coverage they need to their needs. And 4, you allow them to purchase across state lines. You will start to bring down cost. You will make it available to that 15% that right now feels they can't afford it.
Matt Entenza.
You know, Tom, selling Arkansas health insurance policies in Minnesota is not going to cut it. Let me tell you, those Arkansas and Mississippi and Alabama related policies are not going to provide us health care coverage here. Those are stripper policies. Those are policies that tell you, oops, you're pregnant, I guess you're not going to get covered. That's not the solution. Nor is it the solution to do what we've seen Governor Pawlenty do this last year when we saw tens of thousands of folks who had general assistance medical care get tossed off. Now, let me tell you, in rural Minnesota, there's no hospitals that'll take them now. And where do they wind up going? They're going to wind up going to the ER. And who pays for that? We pay for that. Because the hospitals are required to take them in. And of course, we would not want these folks to just die by the side of the road. And then it gets shifted onto the rest of our health care policies. Now, Tom, you have a good idea in the sense we need to create greater pools. Absolutely. Farmers are getting stiffed right now. You should be able to join big pools as opposed to being picked off one by one with $10,000 deductibles. But I believe that the solution is things like cooperatives. Let's pull everybody together. We've gone too slow in Minnesota, and the state hasn't been a partner in that. And then let's make sure that the private sector is forced to compete so we get the lowest possible prices so our farmers get taken care of.
Rob Hahn.
I'll get to my 3 points in a second, but I'm still pondering these stripper policies and what exactly was meant by that. We're going to have a discussion on this later. Yes, I would support a co-op option because certainly we need to do things differently. What we're doing right now from a health care standpoint, from a health coverage standpoint, not necessarily a health care, but a health coverage standpoint, what we have here is not working. So a public option or some form of it, I would certainly support and monitor it closely to find what works well and what doesn't. I would also like to look at more of a total cost of care model, where instead of rewarding people for the number of procedures, we're rewarding and paying people based on outcomes. So it becomes very outcome specific. That's how business should work, and I think the healthcare industry needs to catch up. Contrary to what others on this panel would say, I agree with Representative Emmer. Once again, I don't know what must be in my coffee this morning, but I would like to at least study the possibility of being able to purchase health insurance from out of state. I think that only makes sense. We can do it with other forms of insurance. We should at least have the opportunity to explore it here in Minnesota as well.
Mark Dayton.
Representative Emmer just said he wants to eliminate the ability of Minnesotans to exempt the employer payments for health care from their personal income tax statements. That, according to the Minnesota Department of Revenue, would increase taxes on middle income working Minnesotans by over $1 billion a year. That's the largest tax increase anybody has proposed here today. That's the largest tax increase I've heard anybody propose in this entire campaign year. Over $1 billion of additional taxes paid by working Minnesotans by eliminating that exemption. I totally, fundamentally, completely disagree. Now, in terms of the healthcare cooperatives, yes, we should look at that, and it's instructive from the Citizens League report that the health insurance industry opposed the kind of reforms necessary to allow Minnesota to follow in the footsteps of Wisconsin and others. It's terribly wrong that farmers uninsured have more than doubled in this state in the last decade, as has the number of uninsured Minnesotans increased by over 50%. We need to bring down the cost of health insurance for farmers and everyone else. We need to reduce the cost of health care for farmers and everyone else.
It's time to take our last break, and then we're going to have final comments from our candidates up here. We'll start one. You're listening to the Governor's Candidate Forum from Farmfest 2010.
Right now, decisions are being made in St. Paul and Washington, D.C. that will affect your farm by people who have never set foot on one. And that's why belonging to the Minnesota Soybean Growers Association is so important. MSGA is focused on ensuring that farmer-friendly legislation remains a top priority for state and national legislators. This is something your checkoff dollars cannot legally do. So become an MSGA member today. Stop by tent number 618 or Farmfest or visit mnsoybean.org. Right now, politicians are taking action on legislation that will affect your farm. The Minnesota Soybean Growers Association is here to make sure that your voice is part of the discussion. Your membership in MSGA gives you the ability to provide input on environmental regulations to protect the land, support the use of biodiesel, and ensure the growth of the livestock industry. You can make a difference. Your MSGA membership is the key. Find out more in tent 618 at Farmfest or visit mnsoybean.org.
Are you facing foreclosure? Then come down to Megalo and Partners. We're a mortgage rescue company, and we can help you keep your house. The process is simple. The results are guaranteed 100%. That's the Megalo and Partners promise. Provided you submit to our plans for galactic domination.
If we could have all the candidates please assume their positions. We're going to go to closing comments, so if we could have the candidates reassemble. Have everyone quiet down in the audience so we can hear the closing comments. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for their closing comments.
Make sure you're talking to the right people. Speak with HUD-approved housing council. Free of charge at 888-9-HOPE. That's 888-9-HOPE. Brought to you by NeighborWorks and the Ad Council.
Welcome back to our Governor's Candidate Forum at Farmfest 2010. I'm Tom Rothman. It is time now for our final comments from our candidates. I want to remind our radio audience that participating today are 6 candidates for governor: Margaret Anderson Kelleher, Mark Dayton, Matt Entenza, Tom Emmer, Tom Horner, and Rob Hahn. Each of our candidates will get 2 minutes, and I ask you please to keep an eye on Kent Tesey down here so I don't have to stand up. And if you would like to stand up during your closing comments, that's entirely up to you. I'll leave it to you. So our first 2-minute final comment comes from Mark Dayton.
Well, thank you to Farmfest for hosting this. Thank you for all of you. It's a great turnout here today, a packed house for joining us and sharing these ideas with us. You know, I served twice as Minnesota's Commissioner of Economic Development, and I learned back then that every business on Main Street, Minnesota depends on a healthy farm economy. You know, agriculture contributes over $55 billion a year to our state's economy, and that was last year when farm prices were down to about a third, net farm income was down to about a third of what it was a year and 2 years before. So when farmers are hurting with those low prices and the input costs going up, that's devastating for farmers, for their families, for our school districts, for our cities, our townships, for the churches and other charitable organizations that depend upon that income in the community. So as governor, as my objective was when I was a senator, number one would be to increase farm commodity prices so farmers can make a fair profit in the marketplace. As I said earlier, that's fundamental to the principles I learned from my retail family. That's fundamental to the principles I've learned about agriculture economics ever since I first ran for the U.S. Senate back in 1981-82. And whatever I can do as governor, working with our congressional delegation, working with those of you who are experts in the farm economy to get market prices where farmers can make a good profit, has got to be crucial because, as I say, our whole state depends upon it as well as all of you. That's why I was a strong promoter of ethanol E85 fuel in Washington and would continue to be as governor. That's why I want to support the livestock improvement grants, which are not only help people improve their facilities, it puts people to job in the building trades all over Minnesota. That's why I think we need a dairy research facility, a turkey research facility out here in greater Minnesota, and my bonding bill in 2011 will contain funding for those important projects. Boost the rural economy, help Minnesota farmers.
Margaret Anderson Kelleher.
Well, 6 months ago, thousands of DFLers started to gather in cafeterias, classrooms, and libraries across the state. I was proud to earn their endorsement to be the DFL endorsed candidate for governor. They picked me to be the DFL endorsed candidate because they know a few things about me. They know I'm going to stand up and fight for you. I'm going to stand up and fight for Minnesotans in what is the toughest economy we've faced in a long time. They know that I never quit, I don't back down, and I don't stop. And that's important right now. Minnesota needs a governor who's also going to bring people together. You can look at the Star Tribune editorial. They talked about my leadership style, a leadership style that I learned from all of you when we would go to extension meetings and 4-H meetings and rural electric meetings, of how we cooperatively work together to get things done. That's what I do, and that's what I'll keep doing. I'll fight for good jobs and great schools. I'll fight for the work that we need across this state, including investments in the turkey and the dairy industry in the state for research facilities. I'll make sure every child, no matter where they live, as a mom, has a great education in this state. I am passionate about it. I will do everything. I never will forget where I came from and who I'm fighting for, because all of you remember the 80s and remember when those interest rates went sky high and commodities went rock bottom. My family nearly lost their farm, but they kept fighting and they kept the farm. That's where I got knocked down and I learned to stand up and fight. That's what kind of governor Minnesotans want right now. I'm fighting for you. I'm fighting for Minnesota because Minnesota is worth fighting for. I know it and you know it. I don't want to be your president. I don't want to be your U.S. Senator. I want to be your governor, and I want to be a great governor for the state of Minnesota. I ask for your vote on August 10th and in November. Thank you.
Our next candidate's closing comments, Tom Horner.
The critical issue in the 2010 election is leadership. Who's going to take Minnesota into the future? Who's going to stop the fighting over the political battles of the last 8 years? Because those political battles have left Minnesota in a state that now is going to 4-day school weeks, now has cities like Brainerd shutting off its lights because it can't afford to keep them on, now has jobs that aren't growing at a pace we need to support a strong Minnesota. Look, I think good leadership is smart leadership. And one of the things that I'm smart enough to know is that we need a government that is efficient, that is effective, but also one that gets out of the way, allows teachers to teach, allows businesses to create good jobs, and allows farmers to farm. And we need to make that commitment, and we need to bring that leadership to the state. We've heard a lot of good ideas up here from all the candidates. But ultimately, what we've also heard is the same political debate we've had for the last 8 years, a debate over who's right instead of what's right. We need to focus on what's right for Minnesota. This isn't an election about electing a Democrat or a Republican or even an Independence Party candidate. It is about electing an independent thinking governor, somebody who is going to pull the best ideas and the best people and invest in Minnesota. A governor who comes in with 3 priorities: balance the budget, do it fairly, do it honestly, do it through spending cuts, do it through redesign, and through tax reform. A governor who's going to invest in the future, in our infrastructure, in education, in research at our higher education institutions. And a governor who knows that the strength of Minnesota is the strength of our communities. We need strong communities for a strong Minnesota. For me, this isn't a stepping stone in my career. This is a capstone, an opportunity to give back to Minnesota a little of what it has given me. Thank you.
Closing comments now from Tom Emmer.
Thank you. Thank you to Farmfest. Thank you for all of you for the questions. Thanks to my colleagues for being here with us today. It's been a fun discussion, and it really does set the table for what we're looking at. There is a clear and distinct choice. And before I talk about Doug, I got to make it clear that when I was listening to Margaret and I thought I voted for biodiesel, I voted for E20. Voted against biodiesel, but here's what I would tell you. It's investment and jobs. People have made significant investment in these opportunities, and the next governor needs to support that and make sure that they can continue to survive and thrive and create jobs in this state, all right? So I want to clear that up. But let's be clear about this. I'm not talking about raising taxes. And my friend Mr. Dayton over here, I'm surprised. I think that you've never seen a tax you didn't like. I'm talking about giving people back their money. I am talking about lowering taxes. Everybody up here is talking about business as usual, politics as usual. We've already seen some of that in this state over the last month. It's time that we start electing people that are elected to serve the people, not serve government. That's what I would like to do. And some specifics in this area, we would support the livestock tax credit, not grants, the livestock tax credit. We would support the Rural Finance Authority to continue its good work. We would work our tail off not to create these cooperatives that we're all happy about, but to get you export markets so you can get new markets and new opportunities for your product. And lastly, you want to talk about redesign. If we are your governor, I will work with you to take every enforcement and regulatory agency that touches on agriculture, whether it be the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the DNR, you name it, and put them under the Department of Agriculture, because guess what? Those have to start working with the farmers, for the farmers, instead of against agriculture. That's the promise that I'll make to you. Thank you for having me here today.
Closing comments now from Matt and Tenza.
My family came to Minnesota 150 years ago. My great-great-grandfather was a Civil War veteran. And after making it through the brutal war and beating the Confederates at Vicksburg, they came here to make a new life. They got 80 acres of land near Marietta, Minnesota in Lac-Qui-Parle Township. In the first year they were there and they finally had a crop coming in, the locusts came in from South Dakota and ate them out. And you know what? There were some folks in the community came together that said, we're going to go it on our own. Because if we make it and some others don't, well then maybe we can pick up your land cheap, or we can pick up your cow cheap. And my great-great-grandfather pulled the folks together, and as a veteran, he said, we made it through a war. We are founding a state, not because we were apart, but because we're a community, and we have to be together. And the next year, when they actually got some money, you know what they did? They didn't spend it on themselves. They built a church because they understood they needed to celebrate something bigger than themselves, and they built a school because they wanted to make sure their kids did better than them. That's where our priorities should be, to make sure that we're working together, because when we work together, we all do better. We need a governor who's a son of rural Minnesota. And being from Worthington, I would be the governor from farthest, deepest in rural Minnesota of any governor in the history of this state. And I want to be your governor. We do need some big reforms. We need to scrap No Child Left Behind. It is hurting our schools, and I hope you agree with me. It is terrible for our schools, and we need to get rid of it. And I intend to do that. Instead, we need to support our teachers, have new mentorship programs, and make sure that we're actually focusing on higher standards, not dumbing things down with tests. We need to have a balanced approach to the budget. We cannot tax our way out, but nor can we cut our way out. We must grow our way to greatness, and that is how we will do well. And finally, we need to create jobs, and my job program focuses on rural Minnesota. When we pay ourselves for our energy, when we're paying our farmers for our energy, that's the way we're going to grow jobs in Minnesota, not exporting our dollars, but keeping our dollars here. As a son of Worthington, married to a daughter from Marshall, I want you to know that I will stand up and be your governor, and I would hope I can get your support. Thank you very much.
And our final comments from Rob Hahn.
We've heard a lot about leadership today during the political speeches up here. But I want to talk a little bit about leadership and what makes me different and what makes me better than the other 5 candidates on stage. As some of you may know, I'm an outsider. I'm a true independent. I've never been part of the political system. And I was asked this morning on a radio interview, I said, well, what makes you qualified to be governor when you haven't had this experience? I said, well, where does it say here are the qualifications you have to have? It's because I haven't been ensconced in the system that seems to be going nowhere that I am more qualified than the other 5 candidates up here. I'm a small business owner. I know how to balance a budget. I have the vision and the guts, as my new commercial says, in a kind of a funny way, to look at different problems differently, to have the ability to speak my mind. I'm not tied to special interest groups. I'm not tied to donors. I've never been actively involved in a particular party, so I come to it fresh. But I do it the same way I approached starting a small business, the same way I worked in media before that, by surrounding myself with great people who know much more about specific details than I do and probably care to know. That's what it takes. It takes someone to stand up and be different. When I looked and gave serious consideration to running for governor last year, people said, why do you want the job? It's a $6 billion deficit that we're going to be facing. I said, that's exactly why I want the job, because there's a challenge, and there's a chance, and a good chance at that, with the right leadership to make a difference, to do things differently, to look at our government and say, we have a lot of great things in this state, but we have to change a lot too. It's difficult to do it when you have political ties going back 10, 15, 20, or even 30 years like the other people on the forum today. But I don't have that. I can come at it freshly. I can form partnerships. I know how to negotiate. I want to thank you for taking time to listen to all of us today, and I hope that you'll vote for me on August 10th. 1 week. Is it 1 week from today? I lose my track. Today's Wednesday. I'll get my math. 6 days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, candidates. And as we wrap up, I want to thank our panelists, Kevin Papp from the Farm Bureau Federation, Doug Peterson of the Minnesota Farmers Union, Sarah Dornink of Minnesota Agri-Women, and Mark Nisley of United Farm Credit Services. Thank you very much, candidates. And
for all of our candidates and for Tom Rothman for hosting. If you'd like to